Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Jim Schoff. I'm a senior fellow in the Asia Program, and I run our Japan program, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here today. I'm also a trustee at the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., so I get to, we have a couple people wearing two hats here today. This is our fifth time now hosting the Japan This Year event that the Japan-America Society created about 6 years ago. And the Japan-America Society is now beginning their 61st year, coming off of their big anniversary last year. I always look forward to this time of the year. Our partnership with the Japan-America Society is a great way to kind of stimulate us at the very beginning of the year when everything is new, to work with a lot of terrific people across journalism, think tank scholars, the government, and it's a great way to reconnect with this group of people each year. And lately, I've been spending so much time on North Korea. It's a pleasure to be able to focus on Japan again and get caught up. So I'm looking forward to getting caught up this year. As always, Carnegie is hosting today's event, but this is really a Japan-America Society creation, and they did a lot of the work to put together, to recruit the speakers. It's just one of the many contributions that the Society makes to this town and to our relationship, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in just a minute. For today's event, I would like to take a moment and thank the Executive Director of Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., Mark Hitzig, who's here, and Board Chairman Matt Goodman, who will be moderating the post-lunch keynote speech session. Would like to thank the staff of both of our organizations and Alex Taylor here at Carnegie for a lot of the legwork as well. The Keizai Koho Center this year has provided critical support for this program, and it's given us a chance to really showcase the private sector dimension of the economic relationship between the United States and Japan. And we're also received some support and help from the National Association of Japan-America Societies. Peter Kelly, the president of that association, is here today, and he'll be moderating our first panel. I would also like to just say a quick word of thanks to Ambassador John Malott, the former president of the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. This was he was the brainchild of this event and has put it on the map in this town, so I just wanted to thank him for that as well. So I'll have a chance to talk a little bit more as the moderator of our international panel in the afternoon, but for now I wanted to welcome you all here to Carnegie and express our enthusiasm for being a part of this event today. This is kind of our lighthearted serious policy event of the year. As a quick outline of today's event, we're very honored to be joined by the Chief Operating Officer of Mitsui's largest energy unit, Mr. Hiroyuki Tsurugi, who flew all the way over here yesterday to be a part of this event here today, and he will be giving a keynote speech right after our lunch today on the energy's role in the U.S. Japan relationship. We'll also feature 3 panels today, our usual domestic and international panel, but we'll also do a special kind of post-keynote speech session on the energy question and U.S. Japan economic relationship. A quick note on timing of today. There's a couple different outlines of today's event floating around. We will probably end the first session a little bit before noon so that we have a chance to start the lunch on time, because we're going to try to start the keynote lunch speech by Tsurugi-san at 12:30. That will give us a little bit more time for that second panel discussion. But for now, let me turn it over to Abigail Friedman. She is the CEO of the Wisteria Group, a consulting firm here in Washington, a veteran of the State Department for several years, and most importantly today, the Japan-America Society treasurer. And on behalf of the Society, I'd like to give her a chance to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. This is a great way to start the new year. I too would like to thank the Keizai Koho Center, the National Association of Japan-America Societies, Mitsui & Company, my own organization and the staff that have been so helpful, the Japan America Society of Washington, D.C., and above all, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This is the 6th year that the Japan America Society of Washington has been running this Japan in, now it's 2018, and the 5th year that we're doing it with Carnegie. And I think this partnership has really been wonderful for both of us, if I may say. I just look at the crowd in this room, and I know a lot of people are watching this online as well. This is an opportunity for us to think about the future, to make a prognosis about the future. We promise that we won't look at the end of the year to what everyone said was going to happen this year. So as Jim Schoff said, we should be having a little bit of fun. I actually, as I stand here, I'm recalling last year's remarks when we were also talking about North Korea. We were also talking about energy, talking about Japanese politics, U.S. politics. So let's all have a good time. One important thing is, since I have the opportunity to speak to you all, I wanted to mention a few things that the Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. Hosts. In addition to these kinds of policy fora, we run the largest Japan Street Festival in the United States. This year it will be April 14, I believe I have the date right, the Sakura Matsuri. So please come, bring your family to that. We also have a film festival, the Cine Matsuri, that will be mid-March. And one other thing that, among the many things we do that many people are unaware of, which is the language program that we run. I actually think that's probably the largest one in Washington, D.C. as well. We have Japanese language classes for really all different interests. And I was just speaking to our executive director, Mark, and confirming that we can do tailor-made programs, individual programs. So any of you planning to go to the Olympics in Japan in 2020, now is the time to start learning Japanese. Give us a call or look for the Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. online, and we will fix you up with a program that meets your needs. Anyways, I think that's enough for me. I'm looking forward, as we all are, to the panelists. So thank you and welcome.
Good morning. I'm Peter Kelly of the National Association of Japan America Societies, and welcome. I want to re-emphasize a point that in the kind opening remarks that both Jim and Abigail did. They called attention to John Malott and Mark Hitzig. This program really is the brainchild of John and Mark and the Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. as part of their effort every year to provide at the beginning of the year an update on the U.S. Japan situation. And it's a pleasure to be here on the domestic panel for the 6th year of this program. I was tempted to, I have my list of things that you all predicted last year, and I was going to pull it out, but Abigail has said that we can't do that, so you're off the hook. Our panel is entitled Domestic Political, Economic, and Societal Prospects. And let me, before we go to our panelists, let me give some short framing remarks. If you think about the beginning of 2018, on those three fronts, the domestic, political, and societal fronts, Japan is a pretty stable place. The Prime Minister is the only leader of a major democracy who has been able to hold an election in the last 2 years and win it. And he's in a strong political position, so much so that the term opposition parties in Japan almost requires quotation marks to be taken seriously. He's also managed what few other leaders, Democratic or otherwise, have done in establishing a somewhat predictable relationship with President Trump. On the economic front, Japan has established a pattern of stable, if low, economic growth with almost 2 years of steady economic growth. This has resulted in very low unemployment, but it hasn't yet resulted in either wage increases or given Japan the flexibility to alter the stimulus plans that it has had in place or to reduce the large national debt. The actual action, I think, in Japan is coming from without in 2018. We've seen it in the form of missiles being fired from North Korea into Japanese territory or over Japan, ongoing tensions with South Korea, and a continued level of strategic pressure from China. Our experts will cover all of these three topics. There will be some overlap, but Shiela will concentrate on the domestic politics. Sawamura-san will talk about the economy and societal issues in Japan. And Jim will address the domestic views on the alliance and on defense. Our speakers, I don't think, need any introduction to this audience. Shiela is a senior fellow at the Center for the Council on Foreign Relations. Sawamura-san is the bureau chief of the Asahi Shimbun, arrived here last year. And Jim is the chief executive officer of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. We'll take it in the order of Shiela, Sawamura-san, and Jim.
Don't hit buttons at CFR, so there you go. I'm trained, apparently. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. I'm much relieved. I won't make a mistake. But anyway, thank you to both the organizers for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm a little off the hook because unfortunately I wasn't able to join you guys last year, so I have no predictions to fall back on to be right or wrong. But I am delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see such a large crowd and many friends in the audience. So my assignment is to talk a little bit about domestic politics. It seems odd in this audience that I'll be talking about Japanese domestic politics because I see many of you are already up to date and well informed on this. But I have three basic points I thought I would make. And the first is, I may be the only one in the room, but I think the snap election that Mr. Abe called in 2017 was a surprise. I think it was not what I expected him to do at all. I think we all understood that he was coming off of a summer of pretty severe setbacks in terms of his approval rating, first from the scandals, the breaking of the scandals, and then second from the LDP's pretty considerable loss in the Tokyo Metropolitan Government elections. So I think it was not the time we thought the prime minister should go to the polls, but there he did. He and his advisors in the party thought the timing was right. And of course, he had to make that calculation based on the fact that he would have had to have called an election by the end of 2018, by the end of this year. So smart, risky, but smart. If we look at it in hindsight, 2020 hindsight is always great. He and his party, the LDP and the coalition partner, the Komeito, carried off what I think many people at the beginning thought was going to be impossible, which was to reaffirm the supermajority in the lower house, to give his party a very firm foundation from which to govern. In terms of elections, I'll just say it briefly here. This is the third lower house election, of course, that Abe has won. 2012, when he came back to power, the LDP came overwhelmingly back into power after 3 years of the DPJ. He called a snap election in 2014, which was not so enthusiastic. Voter turnout was far lower. It was a kind of marginal victory in some ways because there wasn't an opposition, there wasn't a choice. And voters seemed to begrudgingly go to the polls. But nonetheless, he came back and he and his ruling coalition got done what he needed to get done, which was to allow them to back off of the consumption tax, right? To move forward with the agenda that they had set from themselves, which was largely an economic agenda at that point. The 2017 election for me was different, and I've just gotten finished drafting a chapter for a volume on the election that for the first time asks me or somebody to write about foreign policy. And I thought it was interesting because when the prime minister called the election, The opposition was similarly in disarray. They were unable really to compete. But I'll talk about that in a second. But he clearly identified two issues, right? One was North Korea, as Peter said. The accelerated missile testing by Pyongyang clearly had put the prime minister in the hot seat in terms of how Japan was going to respond to this. He had two ways of responding to it. One was to strengthen defense, and the second was to advocate strongly around the world, not only with President Trump, but with others in Europe and other settings in Asia, that this is the time to up the pressure. This is the time to take a tough stance on putting pressure on Pyongyang to get them back to the table. So he himself defined this election as a referendum on his strategy of coercion, of a hardline posture towards North Korea, not so much on the defense side, which was interesting to me. He defined it largely in terms of his diplomatic, support for his diplomatic agenda. So that's unusual. It's unusual in Japanese elections. It's not unusual that the ruling party defines foreign policy as an important piece of the puzzle, but it's interesting to call a kind of referendum on leadership in the foreign policy area like that. The other obvious thing that happened in this election, and we all know it, it was the end of the Democratic Party as we know it. The former DPJ now then merged into the Democratic Party. That was the defining topic, I think, for most people who analyze this election, is that Japan's opposition fragmented once more. It's not the first time they've been fragmented, of course, but since the DPJ formed and built a fairly considerable single party and won the election in 2009, this is going back, I think, to where we typically have seen the Japanese opposition parties in the post-war period. Kibo no To, we know, the Party of Hope, led by Koike Yuriko after her summer victory and her previous gubernatorial election victory the year before that, seemed like the winner or the potential winner in the early weeks of the campaign, but interestingly enough fizzled halfway through the campaign when A, she decided she wasn't going to run, and B, it was very unclear really what they were running on. The platform looked so much like the LDP in some ways. I wrote a piece in the early part of the election calling them the compassionate conservatives because she was clearly trying to talk about social welfare issues, work-life balance, implicitly the gender issue. But she couldn't. They just couldn't hold it together through the campaign, and that was interesting. The hype at the beginning was so high, but within weeks they had lost really the Japanese public, I think. The other party that emerged, people didn't think was going to be much of an actor, and that's the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, led by Edano Yukio. I don't know about you guys. I'll be happy to hear your thoughts, but Edano-san has been a very compassionate face in Japanese politics. I have never met anybody in Japan who does not like Edano Yukio, whatever their politics, conservative, liberal, whatever. But led by Edano and a very active and forceful campaign by him on the stump, getting hundreds and sometimes thousands of people to come out and listen to him. He launched the very new but very traditional progressive left party in support of the defense of the current Constitution of Japan. So the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan is all about opposing what is becoming a fairly significant shift, I think, towards a growing consensus that the time has come to deliberate and debate on constitutional revision in Japan. So Edano put a stake on the ground and said, we are not for it. And interestingly enough, his party today is the second largest party in the lower house. So that says to me that the Japanese people are still drawn to a party that is not interested in revision. Whether or not that will catapult his party into a larger position in Japanese politics, I think remains to be seen. Interesting definition, though. Let me just very quickly, because I want to be brief here, two other points. One is, so what does this fragmented opposition mean? Are we really going back to the future? Are we really back to single party dominance by the LDP? I'm not so sure. What I think is interesting about the opposition map is partly, yes, the fragmentation, as Peter said, but it is an interesting new set of political parties that are more to the center. It is not the polarization of the old early Cold War era, right? We have a lot of centrist parties, and in that center, you have more conservative parties. And by conservative here, I'm talking about basically social values, fiscal policy, And in some regards, I'm using the Constitution as a sort of barometer of conservatism, but it's probably inaccurate to do that. And by that, I simply mean they're more willing to think about changes in military policy and defense policy. So you've got more parties. You've got Ishin, right? You've got the Kibo no To, if it manages to make anything of itself. We'll have to wait and see. But you've got parties that are now defining themselves as conservatives as opposed to liberal left. The interesting thing, even Edano, with his conservative new progressive party on the campaign trail and on Twitter, said, I am a traditional Japanese conservative. He used that word to define himself, even though his party, in the spectrum of things, is clearly that's not where they are. But by traditional conservative, he meant, and he explained, I support traditional Japanese cultural values. So even though he has a particular point of view on the Constitution and his party has a particular view on Japanese constitutionalism and democracy, he is still thinking it's important to talk today about Japanese values as a defining element of Japanese politics. So anyway, just some markers there that I thought were very, very interesting. On the left, then, you've got his party, Edano's party, and the JCP, the stalwart veto party. And so what's interesting to me is for a while there, it looked like the Japan Communist Party was going to be the veto party, the party that can say no, right? The Japanese voters were seeing them that way. But now others have taken up that mantle, and so the JCP has lost a little bit. It has never been a communist party in ideological terms, in my view. It was early on in its existence, but I don't think we see it that way today. It really is, in Japanese politics, the party that can say no. Others may take up some of that. So the last piece I'll say is, what does this say about Japanese society? Does this election, or does this sort of proliferation of more centrist conservative parties, does it mean Japan is turning to the right? Should we expect nationalism? I've been running this discussion dialogue project at the council now for a couple of years, and if you have time to listen, we have put some of those conversations on podcasts on CFR. Some of it's about foreign policy, some of it's about what's happening inside Japan. And it's interesting to me, my answer is no to that question, by the way. Japan is not becoming a more nationalist society in any means, and we can talk more about that if you'd like. It's not the nationalism or the word we like to use now, the populism of Europe or even the United States. It's interesting to me in Japan, we don't see any signs of that kind of political activity or ferment. There is no anti-globalist party. The JCP might, if you really twist it a little bit, might be construed that way. But the interesting thing is that all of Japan's political parties embrace globalism. They embrace the current global liberal order. They embrace Japan's place in it. They may have different remedies for how Japan should play its role in the global liberal order, but they don't deny the benefits to Japan of an interdependent global economy or of a continued status quo set of institutions in the world where Japan can play a role. Japanese elections, if we take 2017, are still all about competency and reform. Who can get the job done? Who can address Japan's problems? And I'm sure other speakers will talk to what those problems are. But it is still a competency election in Japan. And I think whatever Mr. Abe's setbacks were last summer, the majority of Japanese still believe that the Liberal Democratic Party is best placed to address Japan's many problems. And so for the opposition, what this means is they have to up their game in terms of competency. They have to up their game in terms of specific recommendations for reform. If you take a look at the party platforms, there was a considerable effort, I think, to be more pragmatic, whether you're in Mr. Edano's party, Koike's party, or still Ishin, right? But whether or not they can persuade the Japanese voter to take a risk on an untested party, I think that the legacy of the DPJ time in office is probably that's going to be a high barrier for just about any future constellation of political parties and going forward. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Sheila. An election about competence. Interesting concept. We will come back to in the question and answer session to thoughts about what will happen to the constitutional revision question during 2018. But let us shift now to Sawamura-san, Bureau Chief of the Asahi Shimbun.
Can you hear me? Okay. Oh, thank you very much. Today, it is a very great honor to be called today to join the gathering of the leading Japanese expert. Here, I think the only advantage I have is being Japanese. And as we read the first anniversary of the Trump administration this week, and I was wondering about what kind of article I have to write tomorrow. So I've been thinking only about President Trump these days. And as many of you may know, thinking about Trump every day is quite a tough job and then with a lot of stress. So therefore, being able to think about my home country of Japan from distance, I think has been great for my mental health. But one thing I noticed as I prepared for today's was that while the Prime Minister of Japan and the President Trump have a good personal relationship, the condition in the United States and Japan, as well as the political approach of both the Abe and the Trump administrations. For example, in both countries, the stock market has certainly reached record high. The unemployment rate is also very low. On the other hand, the actual wage of principally the working class has not risen, and inequality is growing. In terms of their political approach, both men have a strong inclination to stress nationalism. Their leadership style is also quite strong, so people around them often act on what they think he would want, highlighting the Japanese expression so-called sontaku. Both leaders also share the belief that a strong economy makes strong countries. So that, therefore, I came to thinking about the Trump administration, and you can see why my head began to hurt. Okay, so, however, today I'd like to speak a little bit about what's the challenge and the risk in 2018. As the President Trump always blaming the media, like fake news, or they are always bad things about the country. So, please, can I excuse that I might be a little bit negative on that, pessimistic view on that. But this is our nature, our journalist characters. As Peterson has mentioned that Japan today looks okay. The unemployment rate is surprisingly low, 2%. Although it's been 10 years, I previously visited Spain as a correspondent in Europe to conduct research for the article, and the youth unemployment rate exceeded 50%. So that there's those difference between the developed countries is itself a threat. Politics are also stable now in Japan. As you know, last fall, as Shiela-san said, that Prime Minister won the snap election and consolidated his power bases. And although there is a LDP leadership election this fall, at this point, there are no other big political events so far. The procedure for the abdication of the Heisei emperor have been also arranged. And last year, the number of foreign visitors of Japan hit a record of high, almost 29 million people, contributing to the Japanese economy as well. And this year looks to exceed that. However, there are risks as well. We cannot fail to mention the security environment, and probably discussed later today. Japan faces not only the direct threat of nuclear missile from North Korea, but would also be negatively impacted if war erupted between the US and either China or North Korea. Japan-China relationship seems getting better, but tensions were raised the other day when the Chinese submarine entered the water off the Senkaku Islands. According to a survey by Genro NPO, Japanese think tank, the image of Japan in China has slightly is getting better. So sometimes I was asked by my European friend that why is there no xenophobic nationalism in Japan? So certainly there is no political party in Japan that resembles the French National Front or the German alternative for Germany. So it could be said that because there are so few immigrants in Japan, it would be difficult for xenophobic beer to allies. So I do have also the friend in the French National Front in France. He was a former number 2 of the party, and actually, someone may know that he is a specialist of Japanese politics, actually. And then when I met him, every time I met him, he is very much angry about the coverage of Japanese media. I wish Japanese newspaper would stop writing that the National Front is on the extreme right. Mm-hmm. It's because if you were talking about the foreigners' problem, the National Front is more left than the LDP or even the DPJ. So this past New Year, the stories that agitated that Japanese media were the violent incident with a Mongolian-born small wrestler and the tragedy of a company that rent kimono to young people going to coming of age ceremonies, seijinshiki. So it suddenly sees the operation, and despite many new adults paying high fees, they are unable to wear kimono to ceremonies that they should memorize. So that's those news are dominated in Japan. So this was truly the biggest news in Japan. It's the world's third largest economy. It really shows something. But for me, I think this is the biggest risk to Japan because of this. At first glance, things looks better, okay, and on the surface, stability is sinking. With sensitivities becoming down, the sense of an urgency disappearing, and the putting off the issues that we should make an effort to find the solution now. So first of all, I will talk a little bit about politics. And then the big drama from last year and continuing into this year is the division or fragmentation of the opposition party, as Shiela-san detailed right now. Maybe it's better to say that self-destruction, probably. But even if there hadn't been such a confusion over the opposition party, I think Prime Minister Abe would have been in an advantageous position. This is because until now, Mr. Premier Abe has gone ahead and pushed the liberal policies advocated for by the opposition party, erasing their meaning of the existence. Being a liberal is a focus on distribution. This is unlike the small government direction of the American Republican Party. Prime Minister Abe himself has said he is a liberal. On the policy front, the conflicting trajectory of ruling and opposition parties is difficult to see. Also, more attention is being paid to the political style of Mr. Abe. Once you've been prime minister for 5 years, even if there is no reason, of course, among the people, momentum for demanding change comes out. In such a time, he presented a plan to lower the amount of time in the diet for the opposition to question the LDP by linking it to the number of seats they had. So even in opening his prime minister question time, he had a backward-facing response. So certainly the making of the question time related to the number of the seats is relational. It's just a timing of this change in custom. With this satisfaction regarding a long administration has started coming out, the present situation seems to reach out to an image of arrogance. The risk is also shared with the Moritomo and the Kekake scandals as well. No one can clearly conclude there were illegal activities, but making denial by saying we didn't do anything bad with action declining to make public disclosures, an image of the virtue from the norm became to be held by the citizens. Until now, whenever there was a problem identified with the policies, Mr. Abe could rebut it by saying, well, what did the DPJ do? But the days of the DPJ administration is an old story from 5 years ago. So now you can even see a shadow of what used to be the DPJ. The tactics of pushing responsibility off onto the DPJ doesn't work anymore, it seems. And also the Ms. Koike's success in the Tokyo metropolitan election last year showed how easy it is for the winds demanding a change can blow. So in other words, it shows that in reality that politics of Japan has the potential to be volatile. As I said earlier, the economy of Japan looks good if you only look at the numbers, but many Japanese people are not satisfied. Rather, a need over the future is getting bigger. Although Prime Minister Abe has spoken of his enthusiasm for constitutional reform in the new year, it is a question that it is appropriate to spend the political energy into an issue that would split the citizens into two. So perhaps the atmosphere is such that it would be more appropriate to wrestle with the issues that are closely related to the real daily life. According to the opinion poll conducted by the Kyodo News Agency on January 13th and 14th, 55% of respondents were opposed to the constitutional revision under Prime Minister Abe, with 33% supporting it. So one reason for this is particularly the cabinet decision to reinterpret the constitution to allow collective self-defense, which the updated security legislations. But even without revising the constitution, the space for the self-defense forces to cooperate with the United States has grown considerably. Next, in regard to economic issues, I'll make no mistake that escaping deflation is a challenge. The Bank of Japan has already put off reaching its target of 2% annual deflation many times. Although the tight labor market is becoming serious, the result of real wage not growing has been sluggish consumer spending. Because I am not an economist, I want to go further into these issues, but still events featured concerning to the Japanese economy have continued to come to light. In the Japanese business model, although our benefit to shareholders is slim, and also the salary to executive is fairly low, one special quality has been the benefit to employees and the quality of merchandise and the services becoming an important virtue. The event I want to mention those that I think might show a deterioration of the foundation of these ethical features. Even in the manufacturing field, once the pride of Japan, incidents of systematic fatigue are coming up. Kobe Steel, Mitsubishi Material, Toray, Nissan, in the raw material industries and assembly units of famous Japanese manufacturers, incidents of the falsifying material quality data have been discovered. So many of them were exposed to cost reduction, competition, resulting in drop in the quality of the necessary quality inspections, the reality of the fragility of Japanese quality control systems, which until now was the secret to success, were exposed in front of worldwide competition. So if you look at this with an eye to the future, there is a possibility it will cause Japanese people to lose their self-confidence. Thirdly, I will speak a little bit about on social risks. So in his first public remarks after the snap election last autumn, Prime Minister Abe said that next to North Korea, one of the greatest threats to Japan was the declining birth rate and increasing age population of elderly peoples, aging societies. In December, Prime Minister Abe advocated his human resource development as part of the third arrow of Abenomics, which is structural reform. Specifically, this includes making early childhood education and higher education free for low-income families and enrichment of adult education. So in other words, this is all regarding human resource development. So I have had talk that by the year 3000, the Japanese will completely annihilate because of low birth rate. So I feel a lot of sympathy for the last Japanese person because he or she will probably have to carry massive government debt. So at the current rate, it is said that the population of Japan in the beginning of the 22nd century will be about a third of the current population today. So it goes without saying that the aging society through increasing the cost of protecting society will be the biggest factor in putting pressure on public finances. The cost of protecting society has continually increased over the last 6 years. I've heard people say that because the elderly in Japan have a lot of money in the savings account, it will contribute to a stimulus in consumption. So certainly, there also have been a spread of new business due to innovation in the caregiving and housekeeping industries. It could be that with the spread of aging population in the developed world as an issue, this will be a model for economic development. Certainly, I think that temporarily that is a good point. But with the cost of aging set increasing on the one hand, because of the expanding situation of anxiety over the national pension system, there's a possibility that temporary things might be the end of it all. So the diversification in the scope of regular employment, particularly the disparity in pay between full-time and part-time employed people, is becoming a breeding ground for the development of a new cause of poverty. So the structure of families is also diversifying with the number of single parents increasing. So as a result of this, the problem of children being put by their parents into poverty is also quite serious. The risk associated with the declining birth rate can be seen in hard labor areas, which are seeing a tight labor market. In Japan, there is still a taboo over the word immigrant because there have been no plan to accept immigrants, despite there being labor shortage in industry ranging from farming, fisheries, manufacturing, to service industry like retail, tourism, and hotels. Japanese competitiveness has suffered. Because this goes to the root of Japanese identities, there is no easy way to remedy this. While unfortunate, competition in human resources in Asia have intensified, with the exception of the Philippines and Myanmar. China and the states of Southeast Asia are all facing declining birth rates. So Singapore, even Shanghai, have been trying to recruiting the people with premise of a higher salaries than Japan. It could be that when Japan finally opened the door, there will be no one that will come. So it's not that all of these problems begins in 2018, but they have partially begun this year. So what I fear the most is that with things like the loss of confidence by Japanese people and unease towards the future and intolerant nationalism. So far as I agree with Shiela that there's no nationalism in Japan, but intolerant nationalism and cross-mindedness would take root and spread in Japanese society in near future. Already in bookstores, one can see books lined full of prejudice towards China and South Korea, or saying like, isn't Japan great? Or are Japanese being respected, being sold? Something else I'm afraid of is that emergence of a tendency to attack one who is weaker than you, like foreign legend Japan, or perhaps the bashing of the welfare recipient and the disabled who gets assistance from the government. So I also worrying about the rise of bashing against Okinawa from the other part of the Japan as well. So to conclude, I think we have to learn the lesson of Europe and also the United States. So while we are stable, while we are okay, we have to start tackle the real issues. Otherwise, a couple years later, Japanese society will be divided, or real xenophobic populist party will be appeared. And also nowadays, all risk is coming from outside. The risk of war, risk of the massive terrorist attack, or even nowadays, some Japanese people worrying about the unpredictable president in the United States. Or even those risks will not happen, but it once happened, the consequence is catastrophic. So now I think you have to tackle the real issues in 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sawamura-san, for a very thoughtful and view of Japan. So Amura-san speaks of stability in the numbers, but also a sense of unease, and that's it's useful to hear that. Let's shift now to Jim Zumwalt, who will talk about the shift more towards the security end, the U.S. relationship, and also the work of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA.
Well, thank you very much to Carnegie, to the Japan-America Society, and to NAJAS and others for sponsoring this event and inviting me. I feel a bit, Jim, like you've given us an impossible task. You said you want us to predict the future in a lighthearted but serious way. I'm not quite sure I'm going to meet that. Okay, I'm afraid of pushing buttons. I might set off some alarm or something. Thank you very much. I wanted to make 4 main points today. My focus is going to be on Japanese domestic politics and how those domestic politics and public attitudes in turn might affect Japanese foreign policy, a little bit foreshadowing the discussion this afternoon, but really we're going to focus on domestic politics. And I wanted to make 4 main points. The first is about Japanese attitudes toward the United States and how that might affect our relationship. The second is Japanese domestic politics surrounding key security issues like the nuclear umbrella, the debate about acquiring a strike capability, preponderance of U.S. basing on the island of Okinawa, or the islands in Okinawa. Third, Japanese attitudes toward China and Korea and how that might affect their policies. And finally, a little bit of a shift to some of the points Sawamura-san was making about economic policy and the domestic politics there. But first, getting back to how Japan sees the United States, I think from the perspective of an American, it's really a good news story. I mean, Japanese respect the United States, Americans respect Japan. Recent polling shows some decline in that, I think because of our own rhetoric surrounding our presidential campaign, but I personally don't see that's a fatal problem. I think we can recover certainly from that. The other things that are of interest is how many Japanese attitudes are in parallel with the United States. Neither country trusts China. Both are very concerned about North Korea. Where there is divergence, I think it's often about precisely what role should Japan play in a regional peace and security. And there's room for discussions, and some of the debates that are coming up highlight some of those differences. I'm very impressed by the strong Japanese appreciation for Prime Minister Abe's management of his relationship with the United States president, and I think it reflects that most Japanese think it's important for their leader to get along with the U.S. leader. They don't have a choice. They don't choose who the leader is, but our leader must get along. And it really is a bit of a contrast to the last era when we had this strong relationship, which was President Bush with Prime Minister Koizumi. I was in Japan then, and while many Japanese appreciated the close relationship, there was a lot of criticism, including from places like the Asahi, about Koizumi being the lapdog of the president and just doing what the president said. And I don't hear that. And I've actually asked Japanese friends, and they've assured me that that is not the case today. And I think the main reason for that is what the United States is asking of Japan today is different than what the United States was asking during the Bush era. In the Bush era, we said, do more in Iraq. And the Japanese were wondering, why should we do that? What's in our interest there? Now we're saying we have to work together on North Korea, and that's something that's in Japan's own interest. So I don't think what we're asking of Japan is in conflict with Japanese own attitudes about what their government should be doing. And so as a consequence, there's tremendous support in Japan for their prime minister continuing to nurture this relationship to advance Japan's own interests. I think the main reason, as I mentioned, was the North Korean threat, which is paramount in Japanese minds. I think also another reason for this is growing concerns in Japan compared to 10 years ago about Chinese pressure. This is both economic and political pressure. Certainly, the few years ago, the Chinese use of a tool of blocking exports of rare metals to a key component for Japanese industry is not forgotten. The Japanese are seeing the pressure that China's putting on Korea, and particularly on Lotte as a company for the Korean government's decision to accept the U.S. request to deploy the THAAD. So I think many Japanese recognize that this could be us again in the future, and they're very concerned about Chinese economic pressure, but also, of course, concerns about territorial disputes in the East China Sea is another area where the Japanese are quite concerned. So all these factors about Japanese public opinion point to a strong U.S.-Japan relationship that continues, and that's my very daring prediction for the future. However, I do think there's an underlying current of anxiety. This has always been the case. I mean, Sheila knows this as much as anyone. We'll never get to a stage where the Japanese are 100% confident that the U.S. will do the right thing and we don't need to reassure anymore. That will never happen. And I always say it's very good news for Japan hands because we're going to be employed for the rest of our lives in providing those reassurances. However, that anxiety, I think, is heightened now because if you're an ally, having an unpredictable partner is not a good thing. You want a predictable partner. And so that I think some of the policies of our government have heightened Japanese anxiety. And so that's something that the U.S. government's going to have to work on in providing the reassurance. Second area that I wanted to mention is the key security issues like the nuclear umbrella strike capacity. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there's a growing understanding in Japan of the need for a strong security relationship with the United States, and that provides more room for alliance managers to move forward. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be dramatic, politically difficult steps like constitutional reform, but I do think under the surface there's going to be a lot going on. And one area where I can predict with confidence there's going to be progress is both sides on the alliance, the US and Japan, are going to be exploring what new opportunities are available to enhance alliance collaboration because of steps the Abe government has already taken in terms of reinterpreting Japan's role. There's a lot of room there. You don't need dramatic new political steps. And so I think both sides will be very eager to explore what does it mean, what can Japan do in various contingencies. And so there'll be a very active agenda on the part of our alliance managers in trying to explore and maximize the new opportunities that Prime Minister Abe has already provided. However, I always have a however here, the challenge for the alliance, I think, will continue to be Okinawa. And, because of historical accidents, maybe, about half of our forces in Japan are based in Okinawa. We do have a plan to reduce the impact of U.S. presence in Okinawa, but for a variety of reasons, mostly domestic on the Japanese side, but also some opposition in Congress to the funding required. Our plans have been delayed. I think it's important if this is not news to many of you because many people here are experts on Japan, but I do want to make 2 points about Okinawan attitudes. One is that Okinawans are not anti-American and they're not hostile. And a lot of people reading the American press don't really get that. Just one brief illustration. When I was visiting our consulate general and we were leaving by car, the car was being driven by our political military officer. And in front of the consulate at the gate, there was a demonstration of about 50 people holding signs, U.S. bases out of Okinawa and so forth. And all of our State Department training is when you get to a demonstration like that, you lock your doors, you roll up your windows, you get away as soon as you can. And the driver of the car kind of pulls over, stops, rolls down her window and starts chatting with these 2 old ladies in this demonstration. So when we finally left, it was, hello, how are you? How are you doing? How's your husband? When we finally left, I asked her, what are you doing? This is a demonstration. She goes, oh, these are friends from church. And that really showed me that while these demonstrators are protesting the U.S. military presence, they're not anti-American. So that's something that really is important to keep in mind. And but the flip side is in Okinawa, there's a strong sense of victimization that outsiders might be defined as the Japanese army, it might be defined as the Japanese government, it might be defined as the American military, but outsiders are making decisions about our community and we don't have a say and we're unhappy about that. And that's the real challenge. And so from Okinawa's perspective, what they would love to do is to talk directly to the United States about basing arrangements. And of course, that's not in our interest because our bases are there for Japan's national security, not because of Okinawa. But there is this inherent challenge that we face. It's not hostility toward America, but it's an inherent challenge there. And just one anecdote again to illustrate that story. On my first trip to Okinawa, I came down to learn about the situation there, and our consulate general hosted a very nice dinner for me and 8 Okinawan politicians, a vice governor, 2 mayors, 2 elected Diet members who actually came down from Tokyo for the dinner, a couple of local officials. And he suddenly asked me, why don't you give a toast? And so I started with my standard toast about U.S. Japan relations and how important they were. And one of the mayors interrupted me in the middle of my toast and said, no, let's toast Okinawa U.S. relations. And the point he was making is, don't you idiots in Tokyo get it? We're a separate entity, and we want to talk to you directly and have direct ties, and don't ignore our opinions because we're different than the government in Tokyo. And so it's true for American policymakers, we can't ignore that. And I do predict, the other reason I'm concerned about this even more going forward is with the situation in North Korea, the U.S. forces based in Japan are under stress. They're being asked to do a lot more missions, more activities. They're stretched, and that means the chances of some kind of an accident are higher than they were 2 years ago. And it's not so much anyone's fault, but they're being asked to do a lot. Be perfect, never have an accident, but do a lot more activities. And that's a recipe for a heightened chances of some kind of an accident, and that would be very challenging for our relationship. The third one, and I'll be brief here, is on China and North Korea. I think Japanese attitudes are very much going to facilitate their government taking steps that are very much congruent with our own, so I'm not so concerned about that. But the one thing I would mention is, right now, Japanese public is in lockstep with what our policy is as well. We want to see a denuclearized North Korea as a long-term goal, and our short-term tactics are heightened pressure. Everyone agrees with that. The challenge will be at one moment in time if either government, either Japan or the United States, decides to shift gears and begin an engagement approach. That could create tensions. And I recall when Prime Minister Koizumi contacted us, the US government, and basically 24 hours in advance said, I'm going to Pyongyang tomorrow to talk about abductees. And that almost created a crisis in US-Japan relations. And the only saving grace really was Prime Minister Koizumi's relationship with the US president that kind of calmed the waters. But there were a lot of people who were quite unhappy with Japan appearing to break with our solidarity. And so I don't think we can rule out that one country or the other, for whatever reason, might decide to take a step that creates some tensions in our relationship. So I don't want to be completely sanguine, but basically I'm pretty optimistic about our North Korea and China policies. Finally, on U.S. economic policy, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll be brief. I am quite concerned this coming year that there will be heightened tensions in U.S.-Japan economic relations. I grew up as an economic officer in the State Department in the 1980s, a veteran of Super 301 talks, of SII, of all of these very contentious talks, and I do not want to go back to that era. It was not a happy time in our relationship. I don't think it benefited either country. But to be honest, the problem is on the U.S. side here. And if the U.S. government continues to insist on using the bilateral deficit in goods as the measure of the health of our economic relationship, we're going to be in trouble. I do think the one saving grace, I think, is that there's limited bandwidth on the U.S. side. They can't take on every single trade issue that they've identified, and there are perhaps higher priorities on the U.S. side. NAFTA, the China, and the Chorus trade agreement probably are higher priorities, so it's possible that Japan can sort of stay below the surface and we won't have contentious talks. I do think the Pence-Aso dialogue can serve as a useful safety valve in terms of letting off steam, giving us a chance to talk and let off steam. But I am concerned that perhaps the U.S. government will decide they want to take on some of these issues, and that will lead, I think, to some tensions in our economic relationship. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Interesting perspectives on the Japanese support, domestic support for the alliance, and also a worthwhile caution for 2018 around the economic and trade relationship. I want you all to be thinking of your questions. I'll open it up in a few minutes, but let me start with a couple of questions that are 2018 related for all of the panelists. The first one is constitutional revision has come up in the discussion a couple of times, and I'm interested to hear what each of you think will actually take place in relation to constitutional revision during 2018. I think Sheila mentioned as a result of the elections in 2017, there's probably a smaller group that's opposed to constitutional revision on principle in the Diet than there ever has been. So there's political room to do something. But what do you think will happen? First, Sawamura-san and Jim.
So we've been tracking this a little bit at CFR and have had a series of essays that we curated by politicians and by advocates and others in Japan and outside observers as well. So my general view is we will see the constitutional revision debate, whether it's sooner or it's later. I think we're looking at a referendum in the next couple of years, I think. So two things for me is what is going to be revised. I don't think today, if you watch the trend lines, and they're not something to be scared about, they're not abrupt. I mean, again, remember that constitutional revision has been on the Diet agenda of discussion between parties since the late 1990s. We've got a voluminous 900-page report that came out of the Diet at the end of the 1990s. So this is something that the Japanese political leaders have been thinking, not just Mr. Abe, have been thinking about now for over a decade. You've got a referendum law that was drafted, granted under Mr. Abe's leadership, but it was drafted in the mid-2000s and was revised again. You've seen the voting age of young Japanese go down to 18 in large part so that because the national referendum is defined to be open to 18. So national elections now are all open to 18-year-olds, and we've watched that in the last couple of elections in Japan. So the political system is getting ready for the process and procedures that would be that would accompany revision. So if you've got 2/3 majorities in the lower house and the upper house that are maybe not pro-revision, but open to deliberation, then you've got the seeds of putting together what it is that they would come together on. Where's that sweet spot of consensus? And I would have told you, honestly, before 2017 that it would not be Article 9. Zero chance. It will be privacy rights. It'll be environmental protections. It'll be some 21st century issue. I've changed my mind. And it's interesting to watch. So Abe, Prime Minister Abe in his State of the Union, or not State of the Union, that's not the right country, the New Year's speech, right, in 2017, or a little shortly thereafter, gave that very famous speech that was videotaped in front of a very pro-revision audience, which said, let's tweak Article 9. Let's add a sentence that says the self-defense forces are constitutional, right? And I thought that's the silliest thing I've ever heard of. I mean, that's opening up in Article 9. That's a can of worms. That's going to get all kinds of pushback. That's just not very smart. What's he thinking? Guess what? In the 2017 election polling, and excuse me because I'm using Yomiuri polling, I knew you were coming, so I thought we would just balance it a little bit with the other side. No, the polling on the constitutional issue, I think, for Yomiuri is really quite complete and quite good. And you would think the Yomiuri respondents were pro-revision. They're not. But there was an interesting question that was asked in 2017 during the election, and I thought just to share it with you. Before Abe called the election, so this is mid-September, people who agreed with his idea of adding that third sentence to Article 9, in other words, keeping the first paragraph, keeping the language of the second paragraph intact, right? And just adding some kind of sentence or paragraph that says the current, the Jiitai, the self-defense force, exist and they're constitutional, right? It was 50%. 50% of respondents said they thought that was a good idea. Now, again, maybe I'm just a really bad predictor of Japanese politics, so take that with a grain of salt. It's entirely possible. But I wouldn't have thought that possible, frankly, in the middle of, the year that he would have gotten that many people to buy into the idea that, yeah, maybe the Constitution, maybe Article 9 needs that extra statement. It dipped a little bit during the election with a couple of percentage points, and then by the time you get out, once the election was over, another poll was taken, and sure enough, about 50% of the Japanese that the Yomiuri polled said, yeah, I agree with that. I think you're looking at this is just speculation on my part, you're looking at a context of intensified pressure from North Korea, and this goes back to the external risk that we've all been talking about. And I think the Japanese people may be a little bit more not necessarily willing to change the nature of their military or to abandon Article 9, which is what everybody outside the country worries about. But they may be ready to set aside that internal debate between left and right, that legacy of the early period of the post-war period where left didn't think the military was constitutional at all. And the conservatives said it's okay for self-defense. So that debate has largely characterized the domestic debate in Japan. And maybe the Japanese people are agreeing with Abe. It's time to set that internal conversation aside so that the existing self-defense forces don't have any doubt that they are constitutional. And that, therefore, when we make decisions about our national defense, it'll be about national defense. Now, I'm putting a lot of words in Mr. Abe's mouth. But it's interesting to me that the debate over constitutional revision, even Article 9 revision, used to be very focused on that second paragraph, right? Yes, we're allowed to have a military. Yes, and the LDP draft calls it a national defense military. They changed the name. They don't really change it substantively, but they changed the name. That's all gone. And now you've got one of the more conservative LDP, right? like to call him a hawk, but political leaders suggesting, well, let's just get rid of this conversation. And the Japanese people, I think, are moving along on that. Now, does that mean that we're going to have constitutional revision in 2018? I'm going to put my money on yes. And if you invite me back next year, you can say, ha, 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 ha. So to give me a little qualifying wiggle room, I think you're going to have at least a negotiation between the political parties that puts some language on the page. And I think, I would never have said this 6 months ago or a year ago, I think it's going to be that third sentence of Article 9. And it's going to be in the context of North Korea. Sawamura sounds unhappy over here. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. We're not making a normative statement, but it's easy. There seems to be a kind of getting used to it feel in the political, and it may be that you now have a constellation of political parties, not only because LDP and Komeito bought into it. They basically said okay. Although Komeito's not so comfortable with the okay, but I think they would do it. Koike's party, sure they'd do it. But people in that party who are the former people who've been in government in the DPJ, Okinawa, you've got all kinds of people who would say yes to that, right? I think the only people who would say no would be the Japan Communist Party, Constitutional Democratic Party, which means you've got the 2/3 majority, right? If that's what happens. So I'm saying it's going to be teed up. It would take further time. We'll be in 2019 before we get to any possibility of a national referendum in Japan. But I'm a little bit more inclined to put a little bit more of my own my own kind of little crystal ball is I think we're going to have a little bit of it this in 2018.
So I wrote down the yes, but I didn't write down the qualification.
Yeah.
Sawamura-san, what do you think?
Okay. Yeah, actually, our newspaper is sometimes criticized that we are very much opposing anything about the constitutional reform. But I was in editorial board before I came to Washington, D.C. And then while we discussed about constitution, nowadays, the current generation of the editorial writers have a consensus that the constitutional reform shouldn't be a taboo. We have to debate, or we have to start a debate now. And then because there are a lot of issues. Article 9 issues, it is debated, discussed for a long time. But nowadays, once there's a discussion, there's an open door of the discussion. Now there are other points like the emergency situation, how to tackle emergency situation, or what about educational issues. But those kind of discussion is not so well. We have to debate further on various issues on that. So actually, my basic point is that we have to start a debate, more real debate right now on how we reform the constitution. Secondly, I'd like to point it out. Also, we have to debate on what the referendum is. After the referendum in Britain leading to Brexit, and also the presidential election last year, gave the shocking impression that once you have the referendum, it would polarize the countries. So before the referendum, we have to prepare the thorough discussion and thorough debate on that. And then finally, if the Japanese population had reached a consensus, okay, shall we proceed to the referendum? That's okay. But otherwise, we have to be careful of that. Yeah.
Well, far be it from me to disagree with Sheila's prediction. So instead of predicting yes or no, I'm going to more talk about the normative aspect of this. And I think, as I mentioned, if the Japanese government decides to proceed with some kind of a vote and then referendum, that's a high-risk strategy, because what if you lose the vote? What does that mean? And even if it's only a 20 or 30% chance, that's a pretty significant blow, I think. So I just would point out that it's a high-risk strategy. And secondly, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of room already for the alliance to move forward. And so rather than pursuing some dramatic political step, doesn't it make more sense to start implementing the various aspects of our alliance that are already made possible. And then the third point is, if the Japanese government does move forward with this debate, I think that will temper our ability to move forward in areas where we can, because the Japanese side will be reluctant to take a daring step that might influence the referendum. So I think in the short term, the impact on the alliance would actually be negative, even though, you know, a positive vote obviously opens up things down the road. So I'm not going to say yes or no, but I'm going to point out the consequences of such a decision.
So I agree, actually. It would be a very high-risk strategy. I mean, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not a proponent of this. I'm just sort of making things light so that Abigail and Jim will be happy. Light and serious is where we're going.
Serious.
I know people will come back next year and go,
We have to do
you
both.
were wrong. But here's the thing that I think is kind of interesting, Jim, and I think that goes back to the risk idea is, as Sawamura-san pointed out, you can go to the Asahi polls, and I don't think you have polled on that question, to my knowledge anyway, on the, you know, do you support Mr. Abe's idea of the third paragraph? I couldn't find it anyway, but if you go on constitutional revision per se, it reflects what Sawamura-san said, is that you've got increasing numbers. And Asahi readers tend to be more liberal and tend to be a little bit more cautious on the constitutional issue. But you get similar numbers. It's not like Yomiuri numbers are very different from Asahi numbers on this question of revision. Should we talk about it? But on the point of risk, you know, Abe's election strategy was a high-risk strategy, too, in September. You know, he has publicly stepped back from what he said early last year, which is revision by 2020, that I don't have a timeline anymore, right? So he's taken a step back on that, which doesn't mean he's not going to do it. I think it just means he's not gotten as complete, you know, he's not as forward-leaning, perhaps, on timescales. But on the defense stuff, just to put something out there, by the end of 2018, you will have overcome the hurdles. You mentioned the conventional strike, the strengthening of missile defense systems. We are, by the end of 2018, Japan's next 5-year defense program, procurement program, will be set in stone, right? It'll be decided probably around sometime in September, but it'll be set in stone by a cabinet decision by then. So I think there is a way to delink it politically, but I'm not sure today. And again, I would have agreed with you a few months ago, but I'm thinking now we're seeing this constitutional issue being actually separated out from the defense. And I could be wrong on that, but I that's why I'm a little bit more strategy here. One final little point, and I think it's interesting. We tend to think about elections producing coalition governments, right? But what I see now that the fragmentation of the opposition has happened, what I see is the LDP is very well placed to be able to have policy coalitions. This is the one place where they have some room to barter. So whether it's Ishin, right, with some of the socioeconomic, Abenomics issues, where Ishin would say, sure, I'll go along with you, maybe. There's a little bargaining room that Abe may have as he tries to do some of the other policies other parties are invested in. Just a thought, something to look for the 2020.
Great, and now it's your turn. We have about a half hour for questions from the audience. But Ben.
Thank you very much. Wonderful panel, wonderful event. Thank you to Jim and Carnegie for hosting again. I think Jim Zumwalt teased us a little bit by mentioning conventional strike capability, but then not actually discussing it at all. And I want to tease out what you think Japan will be acquiring in 2018, and will this push the envelope in terms of so-called exclusively defensive defense policy, Senshu Boe. We've already categorically heard that aircraft carriers and ICBMs are outside that, but then we're also seeing discussion about using the Izumo class helicopter destroyer as an aircraft carrier with the F-35 on it. That's been floated publicly. So where are we with transcending Senshu Boe relative to constitutional revision, and how much of that can happen in 2018?
And Shiela, I'd love to hear your comment on that as well.
No, thanks for asking that question because I didn't cover that point because I was running out of time. So you gave me a few more minutes. So thanks very much. I think when these discussions came up between the United States and Japan as we were talking, the U.S. side had some questions, and the U.S. government never said no, we oppose or we don't agree. It's Japan's decision, but there were questions, and one of the questions was, would such a capability be integrated into the alliance or something separate? And I think the Japanese have pretty much answered that question, that their vision for whatever they decide to do would be integrated into the alliance capabilities. Second question, which has not yet been answered, is what is the opportunity cost? If you spend a lot of money buying this thing, whatever it is, since your defense budget is limited and you're unlikely to expand, what are you not going to be procuring instead? And is that thing you're not procuring actually more important to the alliance than the strike capability? And so that's a question I think the Japanese still will have to answer, because budget defense dollars are really short in Japan, or defense yen are really short in Japan. And then the third area, and this is one where I think the bulk of the U.S.-Japan alliance discussion will be, is, it's fine to have a tip of a spear, but if you have no spear, the tip does you no good. So having, for example, a cruise missile without any ISR to know where you should fire that missile, it does you no good. And there's a lot of room and a lot of places where Japan needs to make more investments to have a more robust capability to understand the situation and to be able to then deploy any kind of a strike capability. So I think you'll see a lot of discussion trying to help. It's easy for politicians to talk about a strike capability, but you need a whole spear, not just a tip. And there, I think there's a lot of room. And so I think that again costs a lot of money. So I think there'll be some serious discussion. So in a way, debating what kind of platform or what kind of strike, that's an important question. But an even more important question is, how do you integrate this capability into the alliance in a way where it would be actually something useful and contributing to Japan's defense?
Okay. Actually, I'm not an expert on that issues, but I a little bit like to mention about as Jim-san mentioned that our military budget is very much limited, even though the budget was increasing. So we have to use wisely. And then right now there is some concern that among the Japanese people that Mr. Donald Trump, the remarks on American First, asking the foreign countries to buy their American military equipment, that's okay if we really need that kind of equipment, but now the current American president is pushing so hard on the trade issues. So we have to figure out what we really need and what we really being demanded. So and also it is also some concern among the Japanese industry that we have to also need investment to the manufacturing industry of Japanese industry regarding the new technologies or new investment on and so on. So I'm sorry, I don't answer your question, but what I'd like to say that we have to be careful to be also think carefully about what we really need, and yeah.
Just briefly, Ben, to go to your specific question about Senshu Boe, the position began to be developed that this was consistent with Senshu Boe when Ishiba-san was Minister of Defense, was the head of the Defense Agency, and it took some time to develop the language and the reference and things like that. And there's a published paper that Takahashi Sugio wrote. But I'm writing about this because I'm just finishing up a book on some of the transformations and thinking about the use of force, right? And the Senshu Boe argument has been met, that missiles are would be a defensive capability. The question is the situation in which they're used, right? So within which context would conventional strike be still consistent with Senshu Boe was the focal point of that paper that was developed, by Ishiba-san's group. I think Jim's point about how this is going to get integrated into the alliance is really the critical point. It's not what capabilities that are bought. It's really, and I have two pieces. One is, as Jim pointed out, is the hardware piece, which is what capabilities are needed for a strong alliance defense and, if necessary, an alliance warfighting strategy, right? And as we all know, we don't have that way of talking about the U.S.-Japan alliance. We don't talk about it in terms of contingency plans and warfighting because we have a little separation between that because of the way we've organized our militaries. But there are new platforms coming on, the F-35s. What they're going to be equipped with, for example, could give us some conventional strike, depending on how they're equipped. And it looks like they will be equipped with, air-to-surface missiles, which will give them a little bit of a bang for your buck. As Jim already pointed out, the ISR capability, the Aegis Ashore system is very complex. It's going to help us with some of that integration, I believe. So we'll see a little bit more of this later on this year, I think, when things get a little bit more out in the open. But for me, the piece of the integration into the alliance is also about how does the alliance use force together. Until now, because of Article 9, we have separated forces in that conception of using force, right? Japanese have restricted their military to certain operations. We do, right? Offensive, they do defensive to be consistent with the intent of the Constitution. If we were going to act like NATO or the USROK alliance, we would have to have a very serious discussion about how do you operationalize Article 5. And we are there in terms of need. We need to do it. I'm not sure we're there in terms of the politics of moving that forward because we would get into some territory that Ishiba-san has already, and Maehara for that matter, some people have talked about openly, which is, do we have a joint command? What kind of structure will we need? And what kind of political decision-making do we need to put in place so that the United States also has some control over when Japan uses force, and Japan has some expectation about when the United States is going to use force. Right now, as far as I know, we don't have those understandings clear, right? It's a case-by-case, scenario-by-scenario, work it through kind of process is what we've got. But it's a huge alliance question.
Thank you, Russ Size. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I got to ask you sort of to step up a level. It seems to me that there is a potential growing divergence between the U.S. and Japan and sort of world views in terms of the U.S. now sort of backing away from the benefits of globalization, from the perceived benefits of globalization, I should say, from international alliances, international institutions, and Japan still very much invested there. And also with respect to the appropriate U.S. role. This is not just a Trump administration thing, but if you look at the 2016 campaign, on both the left and the right are pulling back in the U.S. from our responsibility as a global leader of making certain domestic sacrifices in return for global benefits. And Japan still deeply invested in Pax Americana and the U.S. playing a leadership role. So are we headed for this sort of fundamental divergence, however American domestic politics evolve?
Let's let each of our panelists have a go at that. Jim, do you want to start? And then we'll, Shiela and Sawamura-san. Big question.
No, thanks, Russ. You raise a very good question. And luckily, the parameters for which we have to predict the future is only 1 year. So I think I will say in the coming year, there will not be a divergence between the U.S. and Japan, mainly, to be honest, because of what the Japanese are doing, which is humoring the United States for a time. We pulled out of TPP, so they're going to continue trying to set up a TPP-like organization where the U.S. could later join. We pull out of Paris Climate Change Accord, they're proceeding. So for a while, and I think at least I can safely say for the next 12 months, Japan will continue to humor us. But I think you do raise a good question, longer term, is there a potential for divergence? And I hesitate to make predictions longer term, but I think it's a risk that you point out.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the answer because it's a quite big question, and then, but actually, I think of course, the TPP issues, the United States playing out with TPP is quite sadness and for Japanese people because it's just not only like the trade issues, but also the how to think about our global order facing the emergence of the big China, and then probably it could be also the. I was very much worrying that what happened at the time of the APEC, and then the President Trump mentioned about he's always saying like the America first, and then although he is pushing the idea like the Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't think it is bad, but still, when I talked with our colleagues who were there in Vietnam, the feeling at the APEC meeting was quite the how can I say it's the wind is blowing for the China, not the United States. So I think still many Japanese people are believing that U.S. should be a guarantor the or protector of the open and liberal world order, and then many people still believe that the United States is coming back to that basis. So I think Japan is playing the role that still positioning itself in between the international community in the United States. That's why I think the close relationship between Mr. Abe and Mr. Trump is good things. Sometimes there are many people are criticizing those kind of relationships, but I, as a bureau chief of the Japanese newspaper, I don't want to write the negative things about the things. Yes.
I'm not so burdened. Let me try. So I don't know if there is a fundamental divergence because I don't know how to think about 2016. So that's where I'll start. So if you think that the 2016 election, which I think, Rusty, is where your question started, it was a fundamental departure point for the United States, then yeah, I think we are on a track. We could be imagining ourselves on a track where there will be fundamental divergence, not just with Japan, but with our allies in Europe, with other countries who have been so committed to partnership with us and in support of the liberal economic order, at least, right? My own view, just to put it on the table, is I don't know yet. We've had moments in the past, clearly, where the United States has reorganized itself. You've got the Nixon Doctrine, right, and Vietnam. You've got Jimmy Carter coming in saying we're pulling our troops out of South Korea, right? That was amended later on. So we've had moments where the American people have elected people who are recalibrating America's engagement, especially its military commitments, but also on trade. Right? In the 70s, when Americans were suffering from inflation, our economy was a mess because of the war and our global role, we had the Smithsonian Agreement. We backed away a little bit from our leadership of the global economy, and we renegotiated, right, the dollar, the exchange, right, the basis of exchange. We renegotiated with Japan in the Plaza Accord when that got uncomfortable in the 1980s. So we haven't walked away, Rusty, from the system in the way that at least the rhetoric of last year sounded like to many of us. So I'm not sure we're walking away. I think we may be recalibrating for a domestic audience. And then I think what the president wants to do is renegotiate the terms, right? I don't know. We'll have to watch it unfold. The American people could very well come back and think that this is an experiment that they don't like the outcome of. You know, I think the president has to succeed and demonstrate success to the American people of many of his initiatives. And so we still have years to go before we can see whether that is going to happen or not. What I think is interesting about Prime Minister Abe and Japan, though, is right? It's the leadership of TPP-11. Clearly, our allies and partners, Japan included, are adjusting. And that adjustment is not going to stop if we change our mind. And I'm not sure that adjustment is a bad thing, to put that out there. Maybe it's a good idea to have Angela Merkel or to have Germany and the UK and Japan assume more leadership in the global economic institutions. Maybe they can form different kinds of coalitions to counterbalance some of the influences from China that may be uncomfortable. Maybe it's not all about us, right? In which case we've got stronger global institutions. Maybe. I think we have to keep an open mind about that. But I think Japan, under Prime Minister Abe, has had a very constructive response, both embracing President Trump, but also not shutting down on the fact that he's got Japanese interests to pursue and will continue to do it. So I think there's some kudos there that go to the leadership that Mr. Abe has demonstrated abroad. But here's the thing, and this is where we're all implicitly talking about external pressures that could unload, a U.S.-China trade war. Disastrous for Japan, right? Disastrous for the global economy. We could have external shocks. You can, if you're a historian, you can go back to the early 20th century and find lots of them, right? 1930s, Japan embraced globalism, joined the gold standard, knocked off at the exact point when the system failed. So again, I don't want to end our panel with a catastrophic prediction, but it depends on. It's supposed to be lighthearted here. Okay, we're not going back to the 30s. But a lot of what we're talking about here is this unpredictability, not just for us and Japan and Europe, of these external changes that are going on. I think that's the anxiety that we're feeling, not just in Japan, but in the United States as well. So I think we're at this, in this moment, I don't want to call it geostrategic change and not be clear about it. Collective management of some of the instability and unpredictability is what's called for here. And kudos to Mr. Abe. I'd give a few minus points to our president on that score, but we're going to have to figure out how we're going to navigate this moment so that we can avoid these kinds of traumatic external shocks. Then I think all bets are off, and maybe a less positive, not 2018, but maybe 2020 or 2025. Or down the road, it could be a little bit more hectic.
We have time for a couple more questions. Right back there on the aisle. Oh, well, here you are. Okay, sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay,
That's
thank
fine.
you. Hi, I'm Sayuri May from Sasakawa, USA. And thank you so much for the great discussion. And I had a specific question for Shiela Smith. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on why we shouldn't expect nationalism now, and also what are some new characteristics of Japanese nationalism, current Japanese nationalism? Thank you.
I don't want to take too much time up here, but let me just quickly say thank you for the question, Sayuri. When I say I don't expect nationalism, it's really the organic kind of nationalism. I think what's been interesting to me to watch, and again, your example of Le Pen in France, the referendum in the UK, they've been driven by slightly different things than I think we have going on in our politics here in Washington, and certainly what's kind of absent in the Japanese case. And so, again, I've got family in Scotland, and immigration, right? It's the exodus of people from North Africa and the Middle East that is rattling in the UK. And you don't have to be somebody who's actually affected. You've lost your job because of it, but there are people who feel that they have. But it's a process that began even before the Syrian crisis. It's a process that began with the expansion of the EU and the inclusion of people from Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe who came in and took jobs. And so there is a deep sense that immigration is no longer in Britain's interest, and that Britain's attachment to the EU is what the reaction is about, right? So for me, it's an interesting, if you look at France a little bit when you're watching the elections in Austria and Germany, there's two pieces of the puzzle. One is the large movement of people, right? And this question of cultural identity, right, is huge in many countries of Europe. Who are we? And we need to go back to being who we were, right? And the other piece is economic, right? And that EU in and of itself is not functioning, right, to protect Europe. And I think it's an interesting statement because it's a very different conversation than what we're having here. We may say, immigration in the United States and immigration in Europe, but the fundamental piece of the conversation is different. What we're talking about is the fact of people moving across borders, but it's hitting our own cultural identity in different ways, in my sense of that. Japan doesn't have the immigration issue. And so the reactiveness and that kind of organic, who are we and how do we defend ourselves against the other who is encroaching on our society and territory, is really not as much part of the Japanese debate, even though I think Sawamura-san was alluding that it could be, right? But I think the Japanese nationalism, when we think about nationalism in Japan, it tends to be a more revisionist historical nationalism. we didn't do so bad things in 1930s, or we did what, we go back to rewriting the terms of the post-war, both the terms of the peace, but also the identity of Japan that came afterwards, that was embedded in the Constitution. That's Mr. Abe's nationalism, right? And I'm not saying that to say it's a good or bad thing. It's just a very distinct thing that's different. But what you can hear little drips about, again, in Europe is you go back to hearing some of the right-wing parties in Europe are also doing the same thing about World War II, right? So whether you're in Austria or whether you're in Germany, reopening this question or understanding of who we are and who we ought to be. And so it is attached to war memory. It is attached to the legacy of the post-war peace. And I think, so there could be a connecting. There you could find more similarities, but at least in terms of today, the politics that brought these parties to power, right, seats in the parliament, is a little bit more about immigration, about the EU. Does it function or not? Does it deliver or not? Who bears the burdens in EU? And a little bit less about the revisionist history. But I wouldn't say, that's where I think on the Japanese side, if you had an economic shock or crisis, you could stimulate a very similar kind of conversation. I think Sawamura-san's right. But I don't see the seeds of it as organic. I don't see it coming from within and something that challenges the elites of Japan to a very different vision of who Japan is. I guess I hope that wasn't too long.
Yeah. At the beginning, when I speaking, I mentioned about what kind of news dominated in Japan this New Year's. One of the issue of the assault incident by Mongolian small wrestlers, and then quite big news. And then, but also I am just concerning that the unhealthy opinion is coming out, especially among the internet, that because a few years ago, many people praised Mongolian small wrestlers to they saved the Japanese traditional sports, sort of things. But nowadays, there are some speech, there's some opinion like they are destroying the Japanese traditional sports, and then those kind of how can I say, the overreaction is a sign of this, some worrisome. And also, like I said, in Japan, if I compare the European states and the United States, the number of immigrants is very small. But actually, there are more and more foreign the residents from foreign-born residents is living in Japan. And then even though there's no strategic immigration policies, actually, it's actually there are many peoples working. If you go to Tokyo, if you go to convenience stores, most of the people working there is Chinese or Korean or Mongolian or Vietnamese there. If so, we have to be prepared about those kinds of demographic change before it getting serious. So otherwise, if I can stop this trend, we can stop this trend of the foreign people is coming in, including the workers or tourists, students, whoever. That's okay, but if it is inevitable scenario, we have to be careful of the reaction, knee-jerk reaction on the people from the outside.
Time for one more question. Someone here.
Thank you for the great panel. I'm Satoshi Nishihata from the Liberty and Happy Science Group. I attend a conference call every month at Council on Foreign Relations. by the way, as Shiela and Sawamura-san pointed out, there have been actually no nationalistic political parties in Japan for more than 70 years, and the constitutional discussion has been taboo for more than 70 years. And I think this is a very extremely unique considering the other countries after World War II. And my question is, what do you think is a fundamental reason for this uniqueness, and what could happen in the future considering the imminent situation like the threat of North Korea or the Chinese pressure? Thank you.
It is unusual that a country that is a constitutional democracy, right, has not attempted to change its constitution at all, right? One of the answers could be a technical one, which is the hurdle is high, right? Article 96 is 2/3 majority in the lower house and 2/3 majority in the upper house, and a consensus that you put forward to the Japanese people in the form of a national referendum. That's a pretty high hurdle. I don't know, though, that there has been an overwhelming demand for change, right? You've always had the LDP be the party that says we should revise the Constitution, but even the LDP, for much of those 70 years, didn't push hard on the idea of constitutional revision. We went back when we were doing that series of essays for CFR.org. We went back into the 1950s to look at polling, and interestingly enough, polling back then was consistent polling on this issue was largely done by the government. And the Japanese government was really trying to figure out whether the Japanese people resented this constitution because it was imposed by a foreign power. So a lot of the questions are slightly phrased differently than contemporary public opinion. They're kind of wondering if the Japanese public is angry about the constitution or doesn't see it as theirs or resists it in some way. And it was really fascinating to me that in the 1950s, the Japanese people there was a little bit more questioning about, should we change it? Yeah, maybe we should. It wasn't such a taboo, but it was not an impelling or compelling, yes, we must change it because it's foreign, let's get rid of it, right? There wasn't that kind of reaction in the polling data. But so the Constitution, I think, has been an irritant to conservatives on the right, like Mr. Abe and his grandfather, who see that as an imposition on Japanese national identity. He said in the Diet a year or 2 years ago now, right? It was done by foreigners, shiroto, right? People with no experience, and in a course of a week. It's slightly a mischaracterization of what happened, actually. But it's, it's clearly the origins of that constitution are bothersome more than the document itself. But I think you have a lot of hesitancy about following that idea, even today, right? And I think it'll be interesting to watch if I'm right, that we are getting ourselves closer to this debate and a real consensus or compromise on what gets revised. You'll hear why. People will talk about why. And I think it's going to be a more pragmatic, as I said earlier, let's just stop fighting about the constitutionality issues because we need the self-defense force for Japan's defenses. It's going to be a fairly straightforward, not a nationalistic kind of reaction. On the larger question of why is there no nationalism in Japan, I would simply say there's always been nationalism in Japan. It's not like today nationalism was discovered in Europe or the United States or Japan, right? It's just the manifestation of nationalism, maybe somewhat different. There's always been, I think Sawamura-san was referring to this, a kind of cultural nationalism. The Japanese are this way and the Japanese are that way. It's about who they are as a culture and as a people. There's been what some have called a civic nationalism, right? But I don't think it's manifested itself completely in flag waving and militarism and goose stepping, that kind of thing, which is what we think about in our imagination. Again, I don't think it's going to be something that is organic, that comes out of something that is missing all alone. I think there is going to be some exogenous pressure that pushes this conversation a bit further. The closest issue I think we've got is the historical revisionism or / war legacy issues. And even then in 2015 on the 70th anniversary, you saw a prime minister try to push that down, revise, revamp, rephrase, and not excite, light up or, otherwise be more reactive and push that conversation forward. I don't see the Japanese people have an appetite for it. It's quite simple.
Well, thank you for that. And if you're interested, nationalism has come up here. If you're interested in in more. There's a further discussion of it in some very nice podcasts that Sheela has on the Council of Foreign Relations website. And the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA has had a continuing series of articles on constitutional revision. So I'm sure that during 2018, that topic will be addressed, and I'm sure that the Asahi Shimbun will continue to address it during the year. We've had covered a lot of ground here. But I leave you with two thoughts. First, the first time we did this was in 2013, right after the election of Prime Minister Abe. And all of the experts confidently predicted that there was no chance that the Prime Minister Abe would tackle TPP before the upper house election.
Yeah.
So we did have everybody coming back the next year,
Saying, oops.
having forgotten that they had made that prediction. But the panelists agree that something is going to happen around constitutional revision in Japan in 2018. And the other thought is that all of the discussions that we've had here, particularly around the security issues, one of the points I think each of the panelists have made is that the issues that are likely to come up have had a lot of serious discussion over the years.
Yeah, they're not new.
And the thing that could change that, the issue that might come up in 2018, which hasn't had the careful deliberation, are issues related to trade and trade policy. And that's a caution that Jim gave and that Sheela and Sawamura-san mentioned. And that's something to watch out for in 2018. Are there issues that come up with their relation to trade that haven't been sort of washed through a lot of the experts and careful political process? With that, let me thank all of our three panelists for their thoughtful discussion. And Jim, we are announcements for what comes next.
We're okay. Listening to this first panel, you guys did a great job getting us started. Truly thoughtful, serious, and yet still lighthearted. And it reminds me to say a special word of appreciation that without the panelists and the speakers that we have here today, really contributing their time and the preparation, we wouldn't have the program that we have. So I just want to say a real thank you to you and in advance to our other panelists for those contributions. So please join me in thanking our panel.